Welcome back to another Boxscore Geek show. I went on vacation and the entire world decided to go insane. But luckily I'm back and we have some extra help to get us back on it. We have a special guest, Greg Steele. So anyway, I'm your host, Ray Alvarez, known most places as Nerd Numbers. With me, as always, is my producer, voice of God, man of many hats, Brian Foster. You can find on Twitter as Boxscore Brian. And as I mentioned, we have special guest who you'll hear much more about, Greg Steele, who also goes by Greek God of Stats online.
Hey,
what's going on, guys?
All right. So what we're going to do today, we're going to run down. So, Greg, you've decided to write the Basketball Bible, and we're going to hear a lot about you because you've been involved with the Wages of Wins Boxscore Geeks group for years. So we're going to hear more about that. We're going to hear more about your new work because, frankly, it made me depressed to find out it was you, Greg, because it meant it was duplicate. But also happy that you put your work out there because as anybody who listens to this show on a regular basis knows, I am perpetually depressed about the state of analytics. And we lost a couple good people like Ty Willinghams at the close of the last NBA lockout stopped writing. And so there was a point in NBA history on the analytics movement where there was kind of the box score group and the adjusted plus minus group, and they were both similarly relevant. And then basically the adjusted plus minus group, kind of to keep this political, kind of Republican partied it, got all the jobs at ESPN, kind of the same way that the Republican Party kind of took all the local government, took all the judgeships and slowly took over. The adjusted plus minus group took all the ESPN jobs, took all the front office jobs, and every day I have to watch some bad regression called plus minus out there. So when I saw your work, I was like, thank goodness, I need more of this because as some of the commenters on the Boxscore Geeks have told us politely, we don't produce as much content anywhere near as much as we used to, and that's just life gets in the way. So I'm so happy to have more on the internet, and that's what we're going to start with. So, Greg Steele, as I mentioned, I know you from the Wages of Wednesdays. You and I both, I think, guest posted there, used to be really big in the comment sections. You and I were both briefly involved in a Wins produced based fantasy league run by Mosey Platt. And what I said to you when we first got back and forth is I said, your trades in that league were so criminal that, basically I should tell you to pay me for looking at your work if I was going to go the same. Right. But that's kind of how we know each other now. So I want to get to know you a little more, and I haven't done as much homework. So let's just start. Like, what got you into basketball analytics and what got you to where you are now writing your own work? That I kind of approve of the methodology behind.
Okay. So I liked basketball ever since I was a kid. And I kind of became a Rockets fan in that way. When I was a kid, I was taller than all the other kids my age and clumsy because, in real life, the tall kids are clumsy. But, Hakeem Olajuwon was taller than everyone else, but was so graceful, had feet like a ballerina. So I was just, mesmerized by how he was so much bigger but so much more graceful. So that was what got me into it, into basketball, period. I got interested in analytics or in NBA statistics, period, as I got a little older and, aged out of when I could really play competitively. I needed something to do besides just watch, or something to make watching more enjoyable or informative. So that was how I got interested. That's how I got my hands on David Barry's work to start with, and got involved with the Wages of Wins. And like you said, we played fantasy basketball for a while, which is fine. But I needed something besides that because the fantasy basketball is good for fooling yourself that you can actually run an NBA team, but there are very few people who can actually do that well. Every fan thinks they can, and of course, me included. But the true challenges of an NBA front office require them to analyze a lot of different data in a lot of different ways. So that was what got me started looking. I had some years ago, I'd gotten really distracted from working on it because I couldn't figure out a way to analyze defense accurately. At that time, there were no shot defending statistics. There were no shot challenging statistics. There were just blocks and steals. So I tried 100 different things to try to use blocks and steals as proxies to figure out who was a good defender. But I never was satisfied because, there are players who get a lot of blocks and or steals, the splash plays, but actually give up a lot of points, and vice versa. So then a few years later, when the league started releasing defensive field goal percentage statistics and stuff like that on the league site, I kind of started digging and working. And that was where the book came from, was just working through all those numbers and all those seasons since 2015-16 when, the publicly available data was so robust.
And I've got to cut in here and give you a lot of credit because this drives me absolutely batty about analytics in general, because everybody has a copy of Dean Oliver's basketball and paper on their shelf. Most people haven't read it all the way through. Even those that have read it all the way through don't understand all of it. And some of that is him. Like I've talked to Dave Barry about it before, where he said, I'm trying to replicate his work. I'm reading his chapter. This makes no sense. I'll email him back and forth. For years, even his win share, the win shares on Basketball Reference that are based on his offensive rating and defensive rating, they basically just said, go read basketball and paper as their walkthrough. And then if you go read basketball and paper, it made no sense. So there was that. But for instance, he came up with a usage curve, which I don't know. Did you read this post I did, Greg, where I compared the newer statistics, the touches statistics that is held on stats.nba.com, and I compared it to usage and just noticed that if you tried to compare that as a regression plot, which would, ideally be a scatter plot with a line going at a 45-degree angle, it was a box. Usage versus touches or time of possession was meaningless, and that's key because usage was invented by Dean Oliver to be a proxy for how much a player handles the ball. So when we get the real data that says here's how much Westbrook or John Wall or Steve Nash handles the ball, and we can compare it to that stat, we go, oh, it's a bad proxy. So what you just said there is huge. It's that all of this new data, I believe, it's not quite league-wide, right? The player tracking data you're talking?
Yes.
14-15, I think, is might be the first season. I think it's 29 teams or something. Am I mistaken there?
Yeah.
So all of that new data got added, and I still don't see people embracing it or use it to even ask the questions that have just become, the usage curve, the skill curve in basketball analytics is just considered, everybody knows this. Whereas when the data came out to actually verify it, it doesn't. And that was actually, so you're talking defense. I want to hear a lot more about that. When I first started looking at your work, not realizing it was you, of course, what made me happiest is that you were going for offensive stuff. And something else you said you did with the tracking was you started adding things like screens and hockey assists and all that. You were using this new data to try and look at impact essentially on scoring efficiency.
Yeah, that's right. So around that same time, the publicly available stats started to include things that you said, hockey assists and screen assists. So my thought there is that, we forever since basketball started, we always keep track of who scores the points. But anyone who watches or plays knows that there's more to it than that. There are relatively few possessions, even in the NBA where the most skilled players play, there are relatively few possessions where the points are actually the result of only one player's actions. Even, some of the greatest, one-on-one scores benefit from screens a lot. Even some of the greatest shooters in the league depend on passes or a chain of passes even. So my work on the offensive end started with that. Started with the desire to apportion credit accurately among the players on a team for the points that team scores.
And just as a reminder, this is going to be GreekGodOfStats.com. And you did a few things that I like. You wrote a book. I'm so jealous because it's, I think everybody in the Wages of Wins group, with the exclusion of Dave Barry, it's like, man, maybe one of these days I can consolidate into a book. I've had a few book ideas. You went out and just did it. You're selling basically, the way I'd phrase it is like 5 years of data for about $3 a season, or you can just buy it all at once for $14.99, as well as you explaining your analysis in this. And like I said,
right.
Go ahead.
I just said right.
Yeah. And then what I'll say about, like I said, your analysis that I've appreciated more than a lot of others, particularly like 538, is that you break it down in a very, what you just said, your addition to the analytics movement is there's this influx of new data. We have these old school you give them credit. You're like, the box score statistics are probably the right ones, but they haven't been updated with this. And again, agreed, like we've said that as an example for the wins produced formula. there is a team defensive adjustment, how well the team influences opponents shooting. And the very simple model Dave did, which I don't actually hate too much, is you take that, you evenly distribute it based on minutes played, you go about your day. But there's easy ways for me to go, you know what? As long as you keep that defensive adjustment in there intact in that entirety, because that is what happened, right? We kept your team to 46% shooting. That's what impacted your wins. We have to look at that. There are a multitude of smart ways you could cut up that defensive data intelligently. And even on offense, one thing I know we don't do is, we don't include charges, right? I think we just don't have the data in the traditional box score, even though some sites have started tracking it. There's other offensive stuff, and you can start cutting it up. And that's what I'll give you credit for, because a lot of times what happens with the wins produced formula is people say you don't account for this. And what I'll say is, one, I don't mind too much. It's a pretty good approximation. That's the purpose of a model. A model is supposed to be an approximation of reality. It doesn't have to be perfect. But then two, the follow-up is there is a rife amount of area where you can start doing exactly that. Changing player positions if you think there are places that you need to do it. More evenly distribute the data than what Dave does right now, which is just assists as an example. And you did that. So I'm really happy to see that out in the ether now.
Oh, thanks. And I'll say in conjunction with that, some of that goes to differentiating players who look similar in the traditional statistical record, in the box score, that is. Not every 25-point per game scorer is the same. Some guys score 25 points a game on a lot of unassisted shots. Some guys score 25 points a game playing catch and shoot. A good way to do this is like to play on the Warriors, just play by Steph Curry and run down to the 3-point line and catch it and shoot it. So we want to know that those players are different. If you're, running an NBA team, you want to know that those players are different, because you may want to pay them a different amount. The guy who is the solo isolation artist versus the guy who's a catch and shoot guy. And the same, of course, also obtains on defense. You want to know if a guy is just he gets steals because he can sag off his man and intercept passes, or if a guy is like a real legit stopper who denies his man the ball. Because again, you may want to pay those two guys differently. You may want to play one more minutes than the other.
And so I want to be careful here, because obviously you have a book with all of your stuff. I'm curious how much you want to go over, because, for instance, I read over, you sent me a walkthrough of your offensive breakdown, which very long, very good. I have some possible questions there. I don't know if it's the best podcast, where I'm like, why did you choose this value for screens, et cetera? But essentially that's what you did. You took very similar to what we already do. So wins produced and myself, like net points. Net points, as a reminder of those, I know you understand, Greg, but just you take the number of shots, you subtract out the number of attempts, and that gets you a more realistic contribution to offense. But you took that a step further, and this is stuff on your work. And I was curious if you wanted to talk kind of from a high level, the methodologies you took for breaking things up on the offense and defense, and then you can say, read my book to read more.
Yeah, sure. So top down, I'll start with offense, because I think it'll be a little more straightforward and a little more similar to what people are maybe used to dealing with. So on offense, we know the points that the team scored. So the first thing that we want to do, and the main thing that we want to do, is say who was most responsible, how responsible was each player for those points. Okay, so we can't just say this player, X player scored 100 points, X player scored 1,000 points, X player scored 1,500 points, and call it a day. But then you're going to have people who want to know the other things that go into it besides just the shooter. And even if you don't, then you're going to have some odd results. You're going to have a lob guy, a roll man, who plays with a really good point guard who scores 15 points a game. And people are going to say, but he's not really that good. Like he can't dribble the ball. He can't shoot a jumper. He just catches it and dunks it, because he plays with Chris Paul or because he plays with Steph Curry or somebody like that. So what I want to do is actually give the appropriate amount of credit to each player. So, and this goes a little bit to what Dre was saying that, he wanted to ask about. That means that we have to be able to correctly evaluate what the shooter does versus what the passer does, as well as screeners and rebounders on plays that involve those. So again, large scale overview. What that means is that I went ahead and compared the average points on assisted versus unassisted plays to determine how much more valuable the assisted shots were than unassisted, and the same thing for offensive rebounds. There's a significant and noticeable and measurable difference in how well teams score on second chance possessions as opposed to how they score just on a regular set play.
One piece of credit I'll give you, another name that comes up on this show routinely, kind of infamously at this point, is Kurt Goldsberry, who came up with the term the Kobe assist. Exact same logic you're saying. Noticed that offensive rebounds led to better second chance points. The irony, though, is that Kurt Goldsberry said, hey, the guy missing the shot is the person adding the value, as opposed to, I believe what you do. And I think, because if I'm trying to remember, you have a very long walkthrough in your book about the offensive, but basically based on how the defender handles, or offender, sorry. It's kind of weird how you want to phrase it, being on offense or defense. The person who gets the offensive rebound, you give them a huge amount of credit to that, depending on how quick they score, et cetera, on getting the offensive rebound.
Right. So there's a value about 20% that teams improve their likelihood to score on second chances as opposed to regular possessions. So that amount, the approximately 20% of the value for the basket, goes to the rebounder, while the remainder will go to the shooter. What this means is that part of the reason the team score on that possession was because they got the offensive rebound.
So just to sorry to cut it again, but just to clarify for the audience, because Dre likes being kind of a little snippy, we're saying the person that rebounds the ball helps the offense by the rebound. Shocking revelation. Anyway, continue.
Right. And of course, the same thing will go, for the just regular assist and for the secondary assist, the hockey assist. Part of the reason on the plays that involve those, part of the reason that the scorer scores is because of the pass or passes that led up to it. So in comparing how much better a team is on those plays as opposed to unassisted scoring plays, we can figure out how much credit, what percent of the credit should go to the passers and what should be given to the shooter, to the scorer.
Can I needle a little? I don't recall if you sent it in the data dump you sent me, but I'm really curious on the offensive contributions last year between Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert, if you have that handy. If not, we can move on and talk defense, I suppose.
Yeah.
And then I'll kind of talk.
Let me grab it.
And so, by the way, just kind of an interlude while Greg is pulling that up. One of the reasons I'm kind of being a little snippy on that is NBA 2K's ratings came out, and I actually made a tweet about this. What I said is, on the one hand, NBA 2K's ratings relate very little to who's actually going to move the needle for any team winning this upcoming season. On the other hand, I've noticed this about NBA 2K before. You have this hive mind that is controlling all the players. And we've said before, for instance, if you look at Carmelo Anthony versus LeBron James, or even like Rudy Gay, you would have to argue it's the mind that differentiates them more than the body, because all of them have very similar body types. So on NBA 2K saying, well, you're saying Donovan Mitchell's an 88 and Rudy Gobert's an 88, that's ridiculous. Obviously, if they're controlling themselves, sure. But maybe if you actually put the mind of LeBron James in their bodies, that would be the case. I don't know if I stalled enough for that Greg.
Yeah, you're good. Okay, so last year Donovan Mitchell was only on offense. I have him as worth about 4.7 wins. He was a good offense producer, but he cost them a lot. He lost 40 points per normal game. So that dragged his efficiency down some. So even though he was a high usage player, what I call an offensive number one, he was still less efficient compared to those players, because obviously, as you can realize if you think about it, offensive number ones, I mean, that's guys like LeBron, that's guys like Kawhi Leonard, guys who score a lot and do it well. So that's a tough group for him to be compared against. However, he was kind of the driver of the Utah offense. Gobert was a really good example of what we were talking about earlier. He's a guy who catches a lot of lobs, and cleans the offensive glass. So he does contribute to the team's offense some. Last year for Utah, I have Rudy Gobert as being worth about 5.2 wins on only offense. His efficiency was real good, quite higher even than the lob catchers. Obviously he's more valuable even than most lob guys in the NBA, which is why he gets paid. However, for both of them, their wins per game were almost identical, about 6.
On is what you're saying.
Sorry?
Am I mistaken on that? You're saying on offense their wins were pretty similar, or just overall?
Yes.
Because we might go defense next, but I mean, what I'm loving that note. I'm curious on a few things. So first off, if you told the standard person off the street, Rudy Gobert is as valuable, if not a little more valuable, because that's what you said, right? You were like 4.7 versus 5. On offense as Donovan Mitchell, most people would look at you like you were crazy. So obviously I'm on board because I'm of the same belief. I was curious that you said he's worth plus 4.7 wins, but then also said he was losing points. So is it basically he's an inefficient scorer, which we know, but you're saying the other stuff he does on offense, including assists and stuff, still contributes to winning?
Yes, there's some of that. When I was talking about the points lost, that's just what I use to help measure efficiency. I calculate in the way that we talked about earlier all the points that a player creates for his team through scoring, passing, rebounding, screening. Then points lost is all the points that they cost their team, based mostly by missing shots and turning the ball over. Now, your average fan would be surprised to hear those two mentioned in the same sentence on offense. And here's why. We have a sort of mental and subconscious way to discount performance, because we know that although even the average fan would admit that Rudy Gobert is really great in his role. Like, he's an awesome lob catcher. He's an awesome dunk man. But what we know is that it's more difficult to be the lead offense creator than it is to be the dunk man. So mentally, we sort of discount that and say, okay, this player is better in his role, but this other player has more weight on his shoulders. And one thing I talk about in the book is that we tend to do this on offense, but sometimes we forget to do that on defense. We tend to, discount or ignore the amount of weight on some players. I call this the Andre Iguodala assignment. People kind of overlook that guy who is the stopper, who has to cover Kawhi Leonard or Paul George every night. But it's, basically just usage on the defensive end.
Something I want to give credit. I've seen you and Ty Willinghams both do this, and it's actually something I've wanted to steal for a while. But as anybody who listens to the show knows, I've got 300 projects on the back burner, and I've you and I are both dads. I know that. I'm a little I'm kind of excited. I've gotten to watch yours, like on your kid on Facebook, and you're doing like the Pee Wee basketball, and I'm waiting for that. I've got mine dunking on the what is the Fisher Price for the hoop we all have, right? He's starting to dunk the ball on that, so I'm getting dreams of that in the future. But that takes a lot out. But something you and Ty Willinghams have done, which I've really enjoyed. So what Ty will do for his wins produced variant that he's done is he'll put a player as this player was plus, was basically a 15-3 record for the team, or an 8-7, which is amazing because as you're pointing out, when we do this, we'll say this player is worth plus 5 wins. What we kind of leave out is if they're an average player, you're essentially saying that player on your team you would expect to get you to a 5-5 record if you had all of them. And I like that. And you do the same. So when you're saying basically you do the points added, points lost, you're giving a scorecard to each of the players. So just out of curiosity, on Donovan Mitchell, you said 40 points lost per game. How many points added per game is he doing?
Oh, good question. Let me grab him back.
Because this is something I'd like to steal in the future, a similar idea of saying points over par is giving a point margin, and the idea of saying, okay, this player gained your team 100 points, and this is what you do in the book, Greg. You'll say they gained the team 100 points, but they lost the team 20 points, so the net impact was 80. We absolutely love that method of analysis.
Right. So Donovan Mitchell created 28.5 points per 48, which is quite good. But as you can tell, and like most players, he lost more points than he created. That's normal, but that's less the case with offensive number one options.
We got some lag here, Dre.
Did I like or did Greg lag out? Because
Skype is good. I think it's just on Greg's side. So the two of us can keep going for a while, and we'll see if Greg comes back.
Okay,
he's back. He's back.
You were saying offensive number one's losing more points than gaining it is kind of normal, but Donovan Mitchell isn't at the same level as some of the others.
Right. And that's, again, to flesh it out more, that's why the average fan is going to say, well, Donovan Mitchell is better on offense. That's because we know that there's a far smaller supply of guys who can credibly do that thing, who can credibly be their team's main offensive option, than there are of guys who can be a credibly reliable dunker. I mean, the Jazz just let Ekpe Udoh walk, and he was a, credibly effective dunker or roll man. But there are a lot of those. They're going to be able to replace that. Whereas if you can imagine that Utah would just let Donovan Mitchell walk, well, who's going to be their lead guard then? They're going to be depending on Joe Ingles to shoot the ball 20 times a game, and they're going to have a tough time on that.
Some credit I can to that line of thinking, which we've done on the show, is, for instance, we think Andre, I was going to say Iguodala, but he works to Drummond. Andre Drummond, we love. We love his numbers. I might bug you on him, or we might say that for a future show. We love him on everything he can do. And then Klay Thompson we think is overrated. But what I also accept is, if I go to the store, the NBA store, the free market, to buy an Andre Drummond, the market for that is much different than Klay Thompson. So teams have to be careful. Now, I think it is possible to moneyball the NBA. I think there are definitely, as you're calling them, number one offensive guys that teams could go after. But I think it is kind of funny. In the Donovan Mitchell case, you're going to be hard pressed to find one, because he's a mid first round pick on his rookie contract. Right. As you're pointing out, his trade value is astronomical, and letting him out the door and just trying to replace is harder. Whereas it makes me sad. I'm a huge Kenneth Faried fan as an example, but when the Nuggets let him walk, I noted we have seen so many times players like Kenneth Faried and Robin Lopez and Tyson Chandler, multiple times, players that do those things just wind up for whatever reason on the free market for nothing, and teams scoop them up. So I go, it pains me to see a player I love go or not get paid what I think they're worth. But I also accept, this is what you were talking at the very top about being an NBA general manager. Being a general manager involves knowing the market and knowing your trade partners as much as knowing the spreadsheets for the numbers as to who's valuable.
Yeah, and to use Faried as an example, last year when Nene got hurt, their backup dunker guy, the Rockets brought Faried in. He played the rest of the season. He was the backup center in the playoffs. Then this year in the offseason, they didn't re-sign him. They signed Tyson Chandler to a veteran minimum contract to be the backup role man. So that's good anecdotal evidence that you can find one of those guys. The Rockets had one get injured, replaced him with another one. That guy left. They re-signed another, or they signed another one. So you can find those guys. Whereas, it would be difficult to imagine the Rockets being able to replace James Harden or Russell Westbrook off the street, just to find some guy who hadn't signed a contract yet and say, will you come, be a veteran's minimum contract to score 30 points per game on such and such effective field goal percentage.
That's interesting. A project I've had on the back burner that I've looked at for fun is the idea of ever winning and trading a star. When we're looking at the Chris Paul trade for the Clippers, trying to argue if long-term the Clippers win. And now that the Rockets have flipped him into Russell Westbrook, I think we're going to be hard-pressed to say, even if Montrezl Harrell and, Pat
Beverly was part of that trade. They re-signed him.
I think you'll be hard-pressed to say that the Rockets lost, especially since the Rockets got immediate returns, right? They got two finals pushes out of that guy, whereas even if Montrezl Harrell and Patrick Beverly turn into good players in a few seasons, they had to wait for that. But to what you just said, this idea of moneyballing the league, how often does a number one scorer wind up on the heap and get acquired for nothing? Because, as an example, one of the most famous cases you'll be familiar with, being in Austin, being near Dallas, is Steve Nash. The story of Steve Nash, for those that have forgotten, is Played really great. Him and Dirk Nowitzki were the 1 and 2 option on Dallas. Were great. Don Nelson, amazing era. Steve Nash gets approached by the Phoenix Suns. They basically offer him close to a max deal. He goes to Mark Cuban and says, "Can you match it?" And Mark Cuban's like, "I'm sorry, you're in your 30s. You've had injury concerns. We just can't do it." I'll give a little credit to Dallas, by the way. They are the king of the fold properly, but then if there's the whole cam for poker fans, realizing they've been bluffed. I feel for them so much because they make good folds. They let Tyson Chandler walk. They let Steve Nash walk. You're like, you are absolutely right to let those players walk. And then they turn around and like turn a team into a dynasty. And you're like, oh, so rough, because from the analytics perspective, we can't fault them. But like even Steve Nash, right? He was involved in trades for major assets. He was offered a big deal. Even these undervalued, underrated scoring options that we think the league doesn't give enough respect to, we're still seeing him get $15 million a year contracts. Whereas it's not the same as you were noted, like Fareed getting picked up for like the veterans minimum for half a season.
Right.
Go ahead.
To answer the rest of your question, you also asked to do kind of a top-down thing on defense. Here's what I'm looking for there. Throughout the modern era of the NBA, we've had blocks and steals to guide us, but what you find is that those are not really very effective proxies. The shot blocker oftentimes can be a player or sometimes can be a weak side defender who comes over and leaves his man to come and block a shot. At one time, Josh Smith was like the standard bearer of this on the Atlanta Hawks, where all Atlanta fans would tell you that Al Horford was really the heartbeat of the defense, but Josh Smith's block numbers would be just as good because he would be on a weak shooter. He'd be able to come over and block the ball. And the same for steals. The steals sometimes will just tell you who is able to gamble or who does a good job of gambling. So those are one type of play, the blocks and steals, the splash plays, the possession enders. But there are a lot of other types of possessions in the NBA, in any basketball league, that do not terminate in a block or a steal. So those are the ones I went to work on. So besides blocks and steals, you have turnovers that aren't blocks or steals. This might be drawing a charge, which we now have a lot of publicly available data for. This may be the 8 seconds in the backcourt. It may be something like a technical foul given because of 3 seconds in the lane in the half-court set. But there are a lot of offensive turnovers caused by the defense in some measure that are not a block or a steal. So we want to give players credit for those the way that we should. We want to be able to say this team has 100 uncategorized turnovers, and this player had 20 of them. This player was responsible for 8 of them. This player was responsible for 15 of them, or what have you. So there's 2 categories. We also want to know who forces misses. And this is where the data that's now publicly available has come in so huge. Because as you mentioned before, we're left with trying to figure out defense as a whole without being able to disaggregate it and say, there's shot defense and there's on-ball defense, there's off-ball defense and all these things. So now that we know how a player is shot against, which is to say what percentage of shots are made against a player, we can do a better job of estimating how much shot defending credit a player is deserving of. So there's a couple of ways I do that. The first way is what I call the volume number. So I'm going to compare how effective a player is at preventing the opponent from making shots compared with his position, compared with the league, and compared with his team. Because it may be the case that he's on a good defensive team, but he's one of the weaker defenders on that team. The 2003 Pistons that stopped the Lakers dynasty are a great example of this. They were a beastly defense because they had Ben Wallace, but they also had Rip Hamilton was on that team, and he was not a strong defender, even though that was a great defensive team.
How was Tayshaun Prince on that team? Because I know he was a super long-armed and was known as a defender.
Yeah. They actually by my fan's eye on that team, which I was obviously younger then, but by my fan's eye on that team, Hamilton was really their only weak defender in their rotation. They had a lot of guys with Ben Wallace, but what I want to know, what I think we all want to know, is who drives that success on defense. To not just say this is a good team, this is a bad team, but to see who really drives that.
Oh, good. I was going to just ask you, what is publicly available? What are the stats that NBA stats that you use to do that?
Oh, right. So for them, it'll be for defense, it'll be their overall defensive field goal percentage, again compared with their position, the league, and their team, and then also their points allowed average on the different play types. And again, those will be compared with position, with league, and with team averages. So here's what that means in simple speak. The centers will be good at stopping shots at the basket. But they're all good at that. Yeah, but they're all good at that because, that's a sample of the population that is the largest physically. So they're the biggest obstacle to a basket that's 10 feet in the air is the guys that are 6'10" to 7 foot. They're not as much of an obstacle as a guy who's 6'4". However, what we really want to know is we also want to know which of those guys are best at defending the rim, and we also want to know which of the guards, which of the 6'4" guys is best at contesting shots at the rim as well. We want to know there's the difference between a perimeter player who gets blown by and then there's a dunk and it ends up on SportsCenter, or the guy who stays in front of his man and is able to force a miss at the rim even though he's small. So that's the volume part, how many of the misses could be to that player. But as I write about in my book, if you only do this, every once in a while you'll get some funny examples because you'll get players that get shot on a lot because they're weak defenders and because the offense is hunting them. Andrew Wiggins was the example I used of this. He forces a lot of misses because people are always trying to shoot on him because, in some of these seasons he's played with Taj Gibson and Ricky Rubio and Chris Dunn and Jimmy Butler. So obviously the offenses want to shoot on the guy that Andrew Wiggins is guarding instead of on the players who's matched up with one of those other guys, one of those stronger defenders. So using him as an example, I talk about how you have to also see how much impact the player has on defense. What that means is figuring out how many misses we would expect them to produce given the amount of shots they face. So if a player faces 600 shots, and for that team, we would expect them to have 300 misses and 300 makes. But on the shots against that player, there's actually 350 shots and 250 makes, 350 misses and 250 makes. Well, then he caused more misses than his team normally does. So that is usually a way that you can use to figure out, to get the data to point at who's the team's stopper is, who the Andre Iguodala is, or the Jimmy Butler.
Question on that. Sorry to keep this as complicated as possible, but I also know defense is the most complicated subject, and I've got a few other questions there. But how often are you able to know, like, if a player gets scored on, that it's their fault for, as you were mentioning, Andrew Wiggins, the volume person, how much it's their fault versus a failure of the defense? I remember when I started examining Synergy Sports when it was new and publicly available, one of the first plays I watched was Kenneth Faried getting scored on by Kobe Bryant, and I watched the play and I went, oh, this was a failure. Kobe Bryant's guy let him go. Kenneth Faried, as you were meant, like weak side defender, had to sag off his guy to go against Kobe. So he's basically standing against Kobe, who at that time was a potent passer. So he's standing between Kobe. He's a big, so he's trying to guard a big at the rim. So it's like, it was almost like being caught in a pickle in baseball, right? It's like, If I close out on Kobe, Kobe's just going to pass this guy. If I don't close out on Kobe, Kobe from mid-range, when open, is incredibly efficient at that time, at least. So I watched it and I was like, oh, Synergy is blaming Kenneth Faried for this play. There was a fundamental breakdown that led to that being Kenneth Faried. Do you account for that at all?
I try to. There are ways to do it better. If, for instance, if we knew in the publicly available data how often a player switched or how often a player rotated or something like that, I'm sure the things that NBA scouting departments talk about. But one of the reasons that I use the play types that I talked about earlier is in a way to try to account for this. And here's an example. If a player is the nearest defender on a shot off a screen, which is one of the play types NBA .com keeps up with. What that may mean is that he tried to go over the screen, but there was no help for him. Or it may mean that he ducked under the screen but didn't get around in time, and so his guy pulled up.
We got another lag here. Okay, you're back. You're back, Greg. Keep going.
Okay.
Got a little technical delays, but you're good now.
That's all right. So that's one way that I try to account for not always knowing whose fault it is to look at different types of actions that a player might be involved in. Similar thing for a pick and roll. We know that it takes two to guard that pick and roll action, but if we look at how good a player is guarding the roll man versus guarding the ball handler, we can start to know something about, like you noticed with Fareed. So like Fareed, and he's getting blamed a lot for failing to guard the ball handler on pick and roll, that's a team issue. That their guards are not getting over the screens and they're leaving their big men in limbo, trying to cover two opponents at once, two offensive players at once. So that's one way that you can know that, okay, the issue here is partly the team scheme. And in the book, I also include some what I call scheme information for the team, where you can say, look at whether a team is better or worse than league average at defending different types of actions. One of the examples I give is a Pistons team. I believe it was the 2016-17 Pistons. They had a lot of shots against the roll man on the pick and roll. And that was because their big man rotation at that time was like Andre Drummond and Marcus Morris. And a younger Tobias Harris. So they had slower guys. So, of course, their opponents were trying to get those guys into switching actions, trying to get those guys moving back and forth, the slowest guys moving back and forth. So I think that answers part of your question. But yes, to answer it more fully, there are ways to do it better.
And then one last kind of question, because this has been one of our contentions about defense, is that defense is you were saying scheme, you were saying, credit to this. It's largely a team activity. You have done a lot in your work now, and as you mentioned in your book, to kind of break it down, to make it more granular, to make it granular in a way we like. Because when we see things like, first off, box plus minus is a bad regression. It's right out. A lot of those are there. But when
538 Dre has a new stat out called Draymond that regresses to BPM. Just got released like a week ago.
I thought it was regressed to but I could be wrong, or RPM, whatever.
Oh, maybe it is. I think it's ESPN BPM, maybe. I don't know.
Well, doesn't matter. We've got a long off season. We will diss Draymond at some point in the future. What I was going to say is, we've kind of thought that team defense is kind of hard, and you're more granularizing it to the player. But I guess as a question I would ask you is, how comfortable are you with the numbers you are assigning to the players with your work?
Oh, good question. So with the offense, I'm quite comfortable. You got to take them all together. I think you have to look at production and efficiency to know how good a player is or how valuable a player is, as well as the load he carries, what I call his offensive position. But I'm real confident on those numbers. As I say in the book near the end of it, the defensive numbers are right for like 98% of the players in the league. There are a few players who are really good at stabbing with their hands and really bad at moving with their feet. And so they get some credit because they have a lot of deflections and stuff and loose ball recoveries, but deceiving. Also, a few of those players, that is the case, and it's also the case that they are their team's weakest defender in the main rotation, and so they get hidden on the weakest opponent score. And James Harden is one of the better examples of this. So you will, if you watch a game, you'll hear people saying Harden was 5th in the league in steals this year or something like that. But of course, if you watch, you'll see that that's because he's playing center field. He's sagging off of his man.
And I was going to say, sorry, because I think Greg lagged out a bit, so we'll try and talk for a bit. What I was going to say, I actually do love that take where I've mentioned, I think at least once a show, right, Brian, how jealous I am of baseball. And I think baseball is one of the sports that the center field metaphor is perfect because baseball understands it. They go, hey, this guy that plays this position, that plays first base or catcher, this catcher for a knuckleball pitcher has a much harder job than, as you were maybe mentioning, a center fielder for a team with a pitcher that throws a lot of ground ball pitches. So I love that. I'm really excited. I have not gotten as much of a chance to dig through the numbers. You sent your original stuff, and I was like, oh, we've got to talk more. I'm very excited. But definitely digging into that, because as you were basically, so you're saying about James Harden, that's a team construction thing. And we've said that before. It's, if you're going to sign James Harden, you know what you're getting, but you damn well better make sure he is not going to be top 2 or 3 in terms of who he's guarding on defensive possessions.
Yeah, right. And you see the same thing with a few other players here and there. But generally it's limited to star scorers who rest on defense, for lack of a better term. I talked briefly about LeBron James has somewhat been in that category the last couple of years. Over my data set the last 4 seasons, LeBron's numbers, defensive numbers, look very similar. Although if you've actually watched him the last 4 years, he's actually been less valuable in these last couple of years than he was before that, because he's been, chilling out on non-shooters more during the regular season the last couple of years. However, because he's able to get his hands on the ball a lot, and because he's able to force a lot of misses against those weak shooters, sometimes the model can be tricked to say, oh, well, he's really adding a lot of value.
All right, so I want to wrap this up for now, and I'm sure we can definitely talk more.
Can I
ask
a follow-up question, Dre, before you wrap?
Yeah, I'll let you go first. Then.
I'll get one question. Sure. Yeah. So one of the things we were talking about was and let me get up the 2018-2019 summative stats from GreekOfStats.com here. So looking at these, they're pretty close to wins produced if you look at that, right? These are both kind of box score based stats, but then like we were talking about, you add in the synergy stats or maybe some other stuff, and so that might change these rankings a little bit. Harden at the top right, Giannis second, Paul George third. That's what someone who follows box score stats would probably expect, for 2018-19, right? But then also Dre was asking a little earlier about the players that are coming up a little different, right? Drummond was a little lower. Clay was a little higher than wins produced. So then another player I noticed on this front page then that is maybe a little different from wins produced is LaMarcus Aldridge, right? And the reason I bring this up is you were just mentioning what are the aspects of what you're looking at here: production, efficiency, and then load. I think the load is the part that wins produced doesn't care about at all, really. So what I guess is the load why Aldridge is a little higher and maybe Clay as well? And what effect does that actually have? And why are we dumb for just saying, oh, just stop shooting so much heavy load guys? Because that's what we would say, right? But you're saying that's wrong, I think.
Yeah, that's partly the case. Aldridge is a little bit different than a lot of guys in that he has a heavy load on both ends of the floor. As we were talking about just a moment ago, a lot of scorers are perimeter guys who have a relatively smaller load on the other end of the floor, except for those few guys, Paul George and Kawhi Leonard and Jimmy Butler, who are, what people like to call two-way stars. On the other hand, a lot of bigs, a lot of what we would call centers, have a heavy load on defense, but not as much on offense. They don't have to create as much of their team's offense unless you're like Nikola Jokic or Vucevic maybe. But Aldridge is not quite unique, but unusual, in that he has a heavy load on both ends of the floor. And in this past year, that was especially the case because the Spurs lost Dejounte Murray before the season began. And then transferring over from Kawhi to DeMar DeRozan as their lead outside scorer, a lot of that weight ended up falling on LaMarcus Aldridge on the offensive end to kind of be that go-to scorer, especially in the mid-range where he's strong, and then also to be their defensive anchor because as everyone knew, losing Murray for the Spurs was more of a blow on defense than on offense. So if the Spurs were going to keep up on defense, they were going to have to depend on Aldridge to be their primary rim defender, and he was. So that was kind of what went into it with him. As far as just differences between what you would expect between this and maybe other box score numbers like wins produced or something like that. You mentioned Clay.
We got another little.
Here's where.
Oh, here we go. Keep going. You're back.
Okay, good deal. Here's where we are on that. Time it's been the case that people have said, Klay Thompson, he's a great shooter and a good defender. but then, without really enough data to back that up, then we're just kind of left wondering, well, what does that mean? Like, he's a really good defender? Does that mean he's, is that worth 2 points a game? Is that worth 5 points a game? Like what is that? If we know Klay Thompson scores 20 points a game on offense, well, what would his points a game be on defense? So we can really say like what his total. So I think when you take account of those things, that's one case where the scouts view, or if you want to call it the fan on the streets view, turns out to be right. It turns out that Klay does give quite a bit of value on defense, and obviously the shooting on offense that we know about.
Oh, so on defense, I hate to bring up the Draymond stat again, but he was also really good at that. But are you saying he's really good at the defensive stats that don't lead to a turnover of possession? He's good at the other stuff you looked at.
Right. Because
he's bad at the turnover possession stats, by the way.
Right. But what happens is that oftentimes, and especially when Andre Iguodala isn't in the game, Klay Thompson gets stuck guarding the opponent team's lead offense creator, because Golden State doesn't want to put that load on Steph Curry all the time. So if they're playing a team with a dynamic point guard, what they're going to try to do is get Klay Thompson on that guy and have Steph Curry defending the other guard who's not as dynamic of a scorer. So then what that ends up causing is a situation where if we were talking about this using the terminology that we use for offense, Klay Thompson has a higher usage level on defense than most of the other players on the team, because he has to be their stopper a lot of times.
And credit I do want to give, and again, to just, like I said, on the wrap up. So I'll stress, this is the key about me. I'm never happy, Greg. I never agree 100% with anybody. I always get so amused when people will say, like, the wages of wins people all think this. And I'm like, if you saw the email chains between myself, Dave, and Arturo, or back in the day when we had the message boards and all that, I'm like, I piss everybody off because I don't agree with anybody 100%. So even in some case, I don't necessarily agree with your stuff 100%. Or as I mentioned, I've got some questions on things I haven't had as much time to dig into. But the way you have gone about it, the stats you have grabbed, the breakdown you have done is what I want people to do. What has become so commonplace in mainstream analytics is to take some box scores, run a bad regression against RPM, name it something cute, and think you've made a metric, and then just kind of say, this is what I thought was important. And on so many levels, that is wrong. And what I liked what you did is you basically said, we know that the underlying fundamental math that I give Dave Barry and Dean Oliver credit for is point margin is the driving factor behind winning in the NBA. And how we distribute credit for that is important. And so what you have done is you said, we have all this new data. How do we break it down and try and start assigning it to individual players, which is what you should be doing if you're trying to make individual player metrics, and if you believe the statistics in the box score and in the tracking data is correct, which we do. So I absolutely love this, and I'm glad it's out there. GreekGodofStats.com. You do have all of your offensive and defensive numbers for the years we have data, adding to my annoyance because we can't go back in time and look at Dennis Rodman in the 80s, because that would be amazing. And as I mentioned before, we don't have like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's shot chart. So I'm angry about the lack of data we have in NBA history, but definitely check that out. We'll have more questions on that. I forget if I had anything more to some of. I'll let you give any more thoughts on that before we go on to around the NBA. No,
go ahead. I'm sure we'll have plenty to talk about. There's been plenty of news, that's for sure.
Yeah, and what last part I'll say, I'm going to make an executive decision, Brian, to either with Greg or without talk about this on a future show. You are doing a retrospective of the process in Philadelphia. It's a 4-parter. 3 of them are out. You can check it out at GreekGodofStats.com/drip. I'm assuming that's your blog area is how you kind of describe it in the main section. Right. Check that out because, Brian, I don't know how much we have devoted to talking about the process, but it's a lot. This is an amazing, amazing breakdown. And what I'll say read it yourself, but the final paragraph in your current part that's up, part 3, is just freaking poetry. It's amazing. So go check that out.
Thank you.
All right. So thanks again, Greg. And we're going to go on to I'll let dealer's choice. Do you want to talk Kawhi and Paul George first, Greg, or Russell Westbrook and James Harden?
Oh, I gotta go with Harden and Westbrook.
Yeah.
That's the duo that's closer to my heart, my fans' heart.
This is I don't know what I did to deserve this as a Christmas gift, but I love it on so many levels. The two biggest, I don't know if you responded to this, but I tweeted out about it. I said, back in the day, you were around in the Wages of Wednesday. We were like Russell Westbrook. Actually, that was when we thought he was overrated. We were like, James Harden is an amazing offensive player. Oh my goodness, you've got to resign him, and they traded him to Houston. We were like, what a boneheaded decision. And there were times back then where they were like, he can't coexist on that team. He's overrated. Usage curve, he can't keep it up, and he has become probably the most impressive volume offensive shooter in NBA history. Am I kind of mistaken on that? Would you agree with that or not?
Yeah, I mean, Steph Curry is the greatest shooter, but Harden has definitely, carved his face on Mount Rushmore of high volume 3-point shooters.
Okay, I'll take it. And so him and Westbrook teaming up again, to me, is gorgeous because everybody said that couldn't work, and now we get to see it. So I'm very excited about that. And also, I feel bad because you said your family is OKC fans. OKC is such a hilarious story. In a schadenfreude way, it's kind of enjoyable to see Clay Bennett just utterly fumble what should have been an amazing dynasty. And honestly, the way I'd almost phrase it, Brian, is that the Golden State Warriors shouldn't exist. That narrative should be the Seattle Supersonics.
Yeah, they should have. Well, the Warriors should have lost to OKC in the playoffs, for one thing.
Oh, well, yeah, way back in the day. But I'm just saying.
You're saying going even farther back.
I'm saying this Bay Area team with an amazing collection of young players in their prime playing together, which we hardly ever see in the NBA, that should have been Seattle. And obviously you even know because you got Kevin Durant, the fact that Clay Bennett moved that team to OKC is what kind of let this window for Golden State to take the mantle of the greatest take hold.
Interesting.
Yeah, and to delve even more into ancient history, the one of the reasons there were the worries about coexisting on offense, but then part of the public explanation was just that the Thunder weren't going to pay Harden a post-rookie max contract, so they figured, well, let's go ahead and trade him. The Thunder traded him to the Rockets. They said we're not going to pay him, so let's trade him for something rather than having him sign as a restricted free agent somewhere and we don't match and we get nothing. The problem there was, at that time they were paying a significant amount of money to Kendrick Perkins as their starting center. So they traded Harden under the rationale of getting something for him instead of losing him for nothing, but then used one of their first round picks that they got from the Rockets in that trade to select Steven Adams, who then supplanted Kendrick Perkins as their starting center. So it was almost as though they lost Harden for nothing just to replace a veteran with a young guy at the same position. Whereas they could have, at the time I argued that they should have, trying to find a way to move Kendrick Perkins in order to free up some money to keep Harden, Westbrook, Durant, and Ibaka together.
And that was actually back in the day where it would have been a tough pill to swallow because they would have lost the money out of pocket, but it wouldn't have cost them salary cap. Amnesty was on the table, and Kendrick Perkins was eligible for the amnesty. So they could have tried to waive him and have someone pick him up to alleviate. They could have tried to trade him, or they could have just amnestied him, and that would have meant that they weren't going over the salary cap with James Harden. And then it got even more hilarious. There was a brief period of time where Steven Adams was on a more expensive contract than James Harden. So it's like, yeah, they didn't want to give Harden the money, so instead they gave the money to a center for a player. They could have, basically to your point, they could have just let Kendrick Perkins walk, signed James Harden, got traded up for Steven Adams in the draft, and been fine and been in a great position.
Yeah.
How do you think it's going to work? I'm curious your opinion. Do you think they're going to coexist together on the Rockets?
So a lot of the questions seem to be about offense, the offensive fit. I'll be interested to see what the Rockets had to do with Chris Paul was let him roll with the second team so he could eat while Harden was out of the game, and then they were together during crunch time. I see D'Antoni doing the same thing with Westbrook. However, one thing that will be different is that obviously Paul is a great jump shooter. Westbrook is a dynamic scorer and dribble drive guy, a slasher, but not a great jump shooter, especially off the bounce. There's a huge disparity between his shooting percentages off the bounce and on catch and shoots. So what we'll want to see what I want to see is if the Rockets are able to put enough shooters around Westbrook in those times when Harden isn't in the game for him to actually run a Russell Westbrook game where he drives and kicks, drives and kicks, drives and kicks. So that'll be interesting to see. I'm as worried on defense as most people seem to be on offense for this team. Losing Chris Paul is tough, and replacing him defensively with Russell Westbrook is a significant downgrade. So I'm interested to see if the Rockets are able to add.
Conventional wisdom is the opposite of that, Greg, which is surprising me. But that's what I'm seeing right now. I don't know what you're seeing, but I agree with you. I think Paul is one of the best, guard defenders of all time, at least of our era.
Yeah. Westbrook, and to be fair, Westbrook has all the skills, all the athleticism to be an elite defender. We just haven't seen him as an elite defender with a heavy load. There's been seasons where he has high efficiency rates guarding the secondary or tertiary offensive options, but we haven't seen him as that guy, as the stopper. So it's going to be interesting. Last year, PJ Tucker took on most of the defensive responsibility of guarding the opponent's leading scorer for the Rockets after they lost Trevor Ariza from the year before. So it'll now be interesting to see, with Tucker returning, but without Chris Paul, it'll be interesting to see if Westbrook is able to take on that type of a load on the defensive end of the floor and exactly how that will work.
And I think another hard part about this team that we're just going to have to see, and has depressed me forever, is the players they put around, because conventional Moneyball wisdom in the NBA says the hard part is getting a star, right? There are a multitude of teams out there this season that I can just say, you have no shot at a title because you don't have a star. And unless one of your rookies breaks out of nowhere, and I mean that, for instance, the process, I know I'm looking forward to part 4 because that's going to be discussing, I'm sure, Ben Simmons more in depth. Are you on the same boat where they lucked into Ben Simmons because he is so far ahead of where you should have expected him, even if he played a rookie contract? A player playing that well in year 2 of the modern NBA just doesn't happen.
Yeah, for sure. And that's another instance where fit will be key. They got Embiid and Simmons, 2 guys who are super effective near the basket, but with Simmons, he's not going to be able to shoot much in the mid-range or from three-point land, or shoot at all in Simmons' case. So they need shooters around him. They need the right guys around him. I'm sure Philly fans were sad to see J.J. Redick walk to the Pelicans. But
T.J. McConnell left too.
Yes. But that's what they'll need. They need shooters around those guys to make the fit work. And as you're saying, Dre, that's going to be a big thing to determine how successful Philly's going to be able to be.
And then also Houston, because that's the problem, is they re-signed Austin Rivers. I don't know if Eric Gordon's on the squad. Part of the weakness of this team has been they have an amazing big three. They have a big three, I would argue, for the last 7-8 years of not Hinkie, sorry. He was on the Rockets at one point, by the way, but of Daryl Morey's tenure, he's had, he had Tracy McGrady and Yao Ming at one point. And then, James.
I know we got Dre lagging here. Greg and I are still here, though.
Yes.
All right, he's not quite back yet.
Okay,
I think you're back now, Dre. All right, good.
Okay, so they've had a connection of big three players on the Rockets. But then it's these tertiary players that should be better, that aren't, that should be. It was exactly what we were talking about at the beginning. Signing a Donovan Mitchell, or more accurately, a James Harden on the open market for less than $15 million, even a mid-range one, right, is impossible. But signing a PJ Tucker, Trevor Ariza-ish player for $5 million a year is trivial. And they had Trevor Ariza at one point, let him walk. It's like the Rockets seem really weird in that middle range where you should be able to pick up these players that do a couple things well, and they have just failed at it. And so we're going to have to see next season what their rotation is, if they turn Eric Gordon and Austin Rivers into something else, if Clint Capella is still on the block. We're going to have to see all of that. I am interested on the defense because I think you're on the same board as some other people that I've respected that say, which is Russell Westbrook, Brian was saying, has a mainstream conventional wisdom of being an amazing defender, but you're saying the last couple of years it just doesn't line up with that.
Yeah, he just he doesn't have the load. He doesn't carry the load of someone that I would say is a great defender. So yes, he does a lot, and especially, I mean, he hits the defensive rebounds better than anybody his size. But as far as being stopping the opponent's main ball handler, you don't see that at least as often during the regular season. Now, for fans who maybe mostly watch during the playoffs or only watch during the playoffs, they may have seen a few games where they say, "Oh man, Russell Westbrook really put clamps on Donovan Mitchell in that series or whatever," and that's fine. But looking at the larger picture, we just haven't seen him carry that type of load on the defensive end.
And the playoffs are so rough because you have one or two games where you play out of your mind. And I mean, that happened a couple. I'm trying to think of specific examples. Like the Nuggets almost lost to the Spurs. I'm missing a guy off the bench. I think it was Derek White. I think that's the right one.
Yeah, on the Spurs.
He put 30-something points on him.
Yeah, Derek White's just like, what if I channel David Robinson for a game? And it's like, well, yeah, if you do that, we're going to lose that game, possibly lose the series. So, yeah, it's really hard to watch playoffs. It's like, yeah, any great player in the NBA can have a lockdown game or an amazing offensive outing. I do like the regular season more. I'll let you get last word on that, and then we'll go to Kawhi and Paul George.
Yeah. Just in terms of what you mentioned, maybe turning Austin Rivers and Eric Gordon into something. Another thing I've got my eye on is the Rockets will be able to. Iman Shumpert has a good mid-range salary, but I think they're going to be able to move him. So conventional wisdom has been that Shumpert's a somewhat valuable defender, and I'm sure that probably was true in his prime in his earlier years. He doesn't seem to be helping as much now, so I'm keeping my eye on if they can move Shumpert for somebody who can, maybe be a good perimeter defender and shoot a little bit. But we will see. I think that will determine a lot of it. Like Dre was saying, the Harden and Westbrook are, about as good as the frontline talent on the other contending teams. But I think where we stand right now, some of those other contenders may have better guys around their frontline talent. So that's the work they have to do to catch up.
Dre, can I get a last word on the Rockets too?
Go.
Okay, just real fast. Because, again, we were trying not to be negative earlier in the show. We were trying to be positive on the work people are doing. I've been loving Crumpled Jumper the last couple of years. He has a great tweet thread on the Rockets, Russ and Harden. He points out that the number of shots aren't as big an issue as the number of dribbles. They were number 2 and number 1 in dribbling. I don't know if that matters for coaching. We'll see if analytics. And then he also has a lot of great charts about should he play them together or apart. So yeah, check out Crumpled Jumper. I love his stuff.
Yep, another one that we definitely like out there. All right, other crazy news that dropped. Also kind of I would say it was the Nero fiddling in Rome, right? This move is what made us know that it was over for the Thunder. And then, of course, Russell Westbrook was traded soon thereafter. Paul George agreed to a trade to the Clippers. Now, by the way, I want to give some over high-level stuff where I yell at teams. So there's this weird narrative that isn't quite true in the NBA that stars are, the racist way it's been phrased is the inmates running the asylum, which I hate that. And there is a very real reason for that kind of mentality to be spouted by owners about players because a CBA is coming up and they want control. But, Paul George wanting to go to the Clippers and the Clippers being facilitated by the Thunder is weird, right? When the Golden State Warriors turned into a super team with Kevin Durant, what baffled me with how much blame was getting pointed at Kevin Durant for hopping ship or for the Warriors for ruining basketball is why no one was yelling at the Mavericks, who we've actually liked for the most part, for facilitating that trade by picking up Andrew Bogut's salary. And the same thing's happening here. The Thunder have basically facilitated the Clippers becoming a relevant dynasty potentially in the NBA now because Paul George was traded there. And if he plays even close to last year, that's a coup. And then, of course, Paul George being traded to the Clippers is why Kawhi agreed to sign with the Clippers. I believe it's a 2-1, if I'm not mistaken. So 2 years.
Yep.
And they have kept a tremendous amount of players underneath. I mean, some of the players that we like that they lost, as an example, Danilo Gallinari. Gallinari is one of my favorites because he was on the Nuggets back in the day. He looked so good and he could just never stay healthy. And last season he had an amazing season, horrible playoffs, but amazing season. But it's like, I don't trust that he's going to stay healthy. But, they still have Montrezl Harrell, Lou Williams, Pat Beverly, Kawhi now, Paul George.
They re-signed Zubats. They're probably going to start him at center.
You got Zubats, who is your boy, Brian. Take credit.
He's my boy. That's right, because I know how to pronounce him.
They have an amazing group of players that, admittedly, a weaker squad facilitated them getting. I believe it. Am I not mistaken? Vegas has them as the favorites for the NBA title this season.
Oh, really? I was seeing the Lakers, but I don't know. It might be now after this trade.
So, I mean, I don't know if we have much to say on that trade, but we had to definitely bring it up. I was going to say, Greg, you actually astutely noted that you're worried about defense for the Rockets. A wise thing to be worried about that team, which has always been an issue with them because of James Harden. Do you have any worries about the Clippers?
Yeah, I would like to see them get at least a B+ rim defender. They got more defensive pressure on the perimeter than any team in the league with Pat Beverly and PG and Kawhi. But I would like to see a little more resistance. The Zubats has a good reputation as a great prospect, but we just haven't seen it.
Exactly.
They won't have Gortat anymore. And last year, near the end of the year and in the playoffs, they were rolling lineups with JaMychal Green as the de facto center, which was probably fine on offense. But I would just like to see a rim defender, at least a B+ rim defender with that group.
Yeah, because Harrell's really good, but he's small, right? He doesn't really get that many defenses at the rim, right? Because he's too small. But he does rebounds and does well on offense, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jeremy Britton pointed that out to me, which is I made the assumption Harrell was more of a Fareed-like big, but he pointed out, he amazingly his production seems to come from offense. He's great at offensive rebounds, highly efficient on defense. He's below average on defensive rebounds, and I'm assuming just based on looking at your numbers, Greg, that he's also not spectacular at any of the what you're calling like rim defending or even high volume defensive stuff that you would want out of a big, which isn't a problem, right? If you've got a talented offensive big of Harrell's caliber, great. A concept we bring up on the show all the time, I call it the Brian Bins of productivity. It's when you're putting a team together, looking for things that you need, and that's what I to keep espousing your work, Greg. That's what I like about how you're breaking it down, because you're pointing, you're going. The Brian Bin of productivity you're weak on is defense, specifically rim defense.
And just one thing on that, Dre. Sorry. It's just it has to do with like the long tail, basically, right? Diminishing returns. If you try to get just like you were saying, Greg, if you try to load up more on perimeter defense when you already have Beverly, George, and all these guys, Kawhi playing on the perimeter, it's like it's diminishing returns for the amount of money you're paying. So that's all that point is.
Yeah. They're definitely. I mean that would make no sense to pay for another perimeter defender, because then. Who are they going to guard? Surely the Clippers are going to have two of those three guys on the floor at any time. So if you had another good perimeter defender, who would they even be guarding? They'd be guarding, the offense, the other team's third option. That wouldn't be worth the expenditure.
Unless it was like for free, but that you only really get to a draft pick. This was all. I just wanted to make another note. It depresses me a little because I'm a Bucks. How do you say like? You want to be a fan, but not quite. I'm a Giannis fan for sure. I live in the state of Wisconsin, and I have a love-hate relationship with the Bucks. But what depressed me about their offseason is they let Malcolm Brogdon walk. They let Tony Snell – they essentially waived Tony Snell because they traded Tony Snell for John Lure and then let John – and I was like, holy cow, John Lure is terrible. If he gets any minutes, this is over. Good news, they let John Lure go for nothing. Now, a phrase Brian popularized on this show – is Tony Snell does nothing well. You didn't do that on purpose either, Brian, but I love it. Good news is under Budenholzer, I do think Budenholzer's an amazing coach. Tony Snell turned into what I would call a serviceable replacement level player, bench player, whatever. He was an average player, so he was fine. But they let an average player walk for nothing, ostensibly. They let Malcolm Brogdon, a talented young player, walk because he was too expensive. And then they picked up Wes Matthews, who has been good in the past, but has just been really beat up. So they basically shed salary and kind of were like, hopefully this backup beat up guy can play as well as the young guy going into his prime for 10 million less, which I'm not a fan of. And I've just said this before, so I just get this point again on the show because it's the last piece of relevant news I want to talk. I'm sure there's other trades that we've missed. We'll try and catch up with them on future shows. But I just want to get into that again because I absolutely hate the NBA having their best players in markets like Milwaukee and New Orleans. It is amazing for the NBA that Brooklyn and Los Angeles have picked up some of the best players. Those are great markets for the NBA. I'm happy about it. Even being, in theory, a fan of a small market team, I'm like, this isn't good product. This isn't good for the future of the league. So I did want to bring that up because it depresses me to see the Bucks basically kind of following the team I compared them to before, Brian, was the Suns, this great dynasty team that instead of just spending the money to win in their prime is cutting corners in their prime and is going to cost themselves a little in a playoff run.
Yeah, I agree. And so for the Bucks, what I really would have liked to see them do would probably be to lock up Brogdon before re-signing Brook Lopez. Now, doubtless Lopez had a lot to do with their success last year. However, I mean, at his age compared with Brogdon's age, I think you have to look at, okay, so how much are we going to get? Where is the needle pointing for these two players? Brogdon has improved in every season over the previous season, so you can tell he's pointing up. So that was tough. I mean, Indiana threw a lot of money at him. That would have been tough for Milwaukee to swallow, but I would have liked to see him retain Brogdon first, and then if they can't pay for Lopez after that, well, okay, find another. But I would have liked to see him hold on to Brogdon as well.
They could have even done Brogdon over Middleton. I mean, they should have gone off of Lopez, but anyway, yeah, that's a good point.
We'll see. I mean, we'll give credit. You're actually saying Lopez looks like he was a good defender last season. We thought his offense under Budenholzer looked pretty good. He's probably, according to our number, even if we were just going on the old wins produced model, a little overpaid. But I mean, one thing I'm seeing that's amusing is people have not adapted to the modern CBA. The average team has, I believe, around $110 million before the luxury cap to spend on players, which means when someone is signed for $10 million a year, if you were hoping for a 50-win squad at $10 million a year, that is to us, like to our numbers, a replacement level player. So I think people are still adjusting to that because, I think Lopez is like $12 million a season. That's more than I'd like to pay him, but he's maybe overpaid $4 million a year. And another thing we've said is you can always move a player. Chris Paul proves that. No contract in the NBA is unmovable. So if Brook Lopez is just good for the next 2 seasons, and then you move him, you're fine. And I think people overlook that a lot. Now I think they probably could have picked up a better player based on, say, like Hassan Whiteside was on the market, right? Maybe they could have gone after him. Who knows? But yeah, I think letting Brogdon go was the bigger flaw. And Lopez was like inefficiently spending money. But we're actually saying if you're a contender and you want to keep contending, sometimes just inefficiently spend money so you can get a title.
Yeah, and offensively for Lopez with the Bucks is great. That's what if they would have let him leave, they could have lost that, having a guy who can shoot from the perimeter but can also be the rim defender. That's what they really need next to Giannis. They need shooters to unclog the lane for him to drive.
Yeah.
So I'm with that. I'm with them on that. But to Dre's point, if you want to save money, you can still save money in the future, but you can't get Brogdon back after he, signs with Indiana. Or, I mean, it was technically a sign and trade, but they did the sign and trade because they weren't going to match Indiana's offer sheet. Once you do that, you can't get him back. You can keep him and Middleton and Lopez now, and then if Lopez starts to decline, you can flip Lopez later on and try and save money, but you can't get Brogdon back after the fact.
Oh, I love that.
Try and remember to put that in the write up. I know with the notes. I mean, this the good news about this is like this write up is like 3 links, so I might try and add that point because I do love it. Is that you can't untrade a player, but you can always salary dump a player you think is going to be on the downhill slide. And especially, I mean, that's the funny part. Like for Chris Paul, even though we end up agreeing with the Dave Barry article that he wrote about Chris Paul, which is Chris Paul signed to a $160 million contract. And he was like, he's not worth this contract. Well, the Rockets did what they needed to, which is they probably got close to value, if not overvalue when you factor in the playoffs for him for those first 2 seasons. And then boom, turned him around and amazingly kept value. So I love that point. All right, that we got through all of our topics. I was going to say, Greg, anything else you want to say before we head out?
No, you covered it all. Thank you so much for having me on. I had a great time talking about it, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Head over to the site, GreekGodOfStats.com, to check everything out. If anyone has any questions, leave them in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer.
And also Greek God of Stats on Twitter as well. And
That's right.
You've got like 12 followers, but you've got some good ones. You got me and Brian already, so I'm sure.
Hey.
But yeah, and
that's why quality over quantity.
Exactly. And then also, just like I said, this is even if there might be areas which I'm sure you'll potentially hear about on the show in the future where I disagree, at least it'll be going, I agree with, in theory, the methodology, and then have specific foibles with that, as opposed to just going, like I said, when Brian passed along Draymond, which we may or may not discuss this offseason, Brian will say that's 538's new defensive stat. When he passed along Draymond, I just read the first paragraph. I was like, no, I don't want to discuss this at all. Sorry.
It's not just to troll you, Dre. It's more like, 538 has a new stat. I know this is going to be a hard week for us, so we got to mentally prepare ourselves and get ready for it.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And you did it while I was on vacation. All right, so reminder, Dre Alvarez, Nerd Numbers on Twitter. Greg Steele. I was going to say your real name might be cooler than your pseudonym with Greek God of Stats, but both awesome. Greek God of Stats on Twitter. Brian Foster, Boxscore Brian on Twitter. This has been the Boxscore Geeks Show. You can find us at boxscoregeeks.com. We go live every week. It's been turning into Monday at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, twitch.tv/Nerd Numbers. And then, of course, you can catch the video recaps channel, Nerd Numbers on YouTube. And then we do have iTunes and Stitcher podcast version of the store, the Boxscore Geeks. Subscribe, upvote, helps us out. And then, of course, go over to Greek God of Stats if you want all of Greg's work. He's got it in book form. Or you can just follow both the blog and his numbers, which are over there as well. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next week.